The cleanest gloves always hide the dirtiest secrets. I didn't understand what that meant until the night I picked up a single white glove from a polished marble floor and accidentally stepped into a world that would never let me walk away. My name is Claire Bennett, and at 27 years old, I believed every problem had a reasonable explanation. I worked as the event coordinator for the Ashcroft Foundation in Manhattan, organizing charity galas where wealthy donors smiled beneath crystal chandeliers and promised to change the world with checks larger than my yearly salary. My job wasn't glamorous. It was making sure champagne stayed cold, floral arrangements stayed perfect, and powerful people never had a reason to complain. That October evening, rain painted silver streaks across the towering windows of the Grand Astoria ballroom while a string quartet floated soft music through the air. Outside, the city looked blurred beneath the storm. Inside, everything sparkled. Diamonds reflected candlelight. Tailored tuxedos drifted through conversations about investments and philanthropy. Every laugh sounded polished. Every handshake looked rehearsed. I moved through the crowd carrying a digital tablet, checking schedules, greeting volunteers, quietly solving problems before anyone important noticed them. It was the kind of invisible work I had become very good at. Around 8:30, the ballroom lights dimmed slightly for the foundation president's speech. Hundreds of guests turned toward the stage. That was when I noticed him. He stood alone near the back of the room, untouched by the applause surrounding him. His charcoal suit fit like it had been made for him alone. Dark hair, calm eyes, posture so perfectly controlled that even standing still seemed intentional. People gave him space without realizing they were doing it. No introduction. No announcement. Yet somehow he looked like the only person who truly owned the room. Someone beside me whispered his name so quietly I almost missed it. Ethan Moretti. The name meant nothing to me then, but the silence that followed it told me it meant everything to everyone else. Before I could ask another question, one of the servers rushed past carrying a tray of wine glasses. Someone brushed his shoulder. A single white glove slipped from another guest's hand and landed near the edge of the ballroom, almost hidden beneath a linen-covered table. Nobody seemed to notice. I bent down automatically. Years of organizing events had trained me to pick up anything that didn't belong on the floor. The glove felt impossibly soft, expensive enough that I hesitated before touching it with my bare hand. As I lifted it, I noticed the faintest rust-colored mark near one fingertip, barely visible beneath the ballroom lights, almost like dried paint. I looked around for its owner. My eyes met Ethan Moretti's across the crowded room. He wasn't speaking. He wasn't smiling. He simply watched me holding that glove, and for reasons I couldn't explain, every sound around me seemed to disappear. Then he began walking toward me with slow, measured steps while everyone else remained focused on the stage. He stopped only a few feet away, his gaze never leaving the glove in my hand. His voice was calm enough to be mistaken for kindness. "Miss Bennett," he said, somehow already knowing my name, "I think you're holding something that was never supposed to be found." He should not have known my name. That thought echoed through my mind long after the music returned and polite applause filled the ballroom again. I stared at Ethan Moretti, still holding the white glove as though it had suddenly become far heavier than a piece of fine leather should ever feel. His expression remained calm, almost unreadable, but there was something behind his eyes that warned me not to ask the questions already racing through my head. "I believe this belongs to you," I said, forcing a professional smile as I extended my hand. He did not reach for it immediately. Instead, his attention drifted briefly to the faint mark near the fingertip before returning to me. "Thank you," he replied quietly. Most people would have walked past it. I laughed nervously. Occupational habit. I spend my evenings picking up problems before anyone notices them. For the first time, the corner of his mouth moved ever so slightly. It was not quite a smile. That can be a dangerous habit. Before I could respond, one of the foundation board members hurried over with obvious excitement. "Mr. Moretti, everyone has been hoping you would say a few words tonight." Ethan never looked away from me. "Perhaps another time." The board member forced a polite nod and disappeared almost as quickly as he had arrived. I suddenly realized something unsettling. Every person who approached Ethan seemed careful, measured, almost rehearsed. Nobody interrupted him for long. Nobody questioned him. Even the most influential donors lowered their voices around him without thinking. It was as though the room itself adjusted whenever he moved. My radio crackled softly at my waist. A volunteer needed extra seating near the east wing. Grateful for an excuse to leave, I nodded politely. "Enjoy the rest of your evening, Mr. Moretti." As I turned away, his voice stopped me once more. "Miss Bennett." I looked back. "Forget about the glove." I blinked. "I already have." He studied my face for another silent moment. "Good." I spent the next hour convincing myself the conversation had simply been unusual because wealthy people often behaved in unusual ways. The gala continued without incident. Speeches ended. Donations exceeded expectations. Guests laughed over coffee and dessert while photographers captured carefully staged smiles. Shortly after 10:30, the ballroom slowly began to empty. Staff members folded linens while florists packed centerpieces into large containers. I finally slipped outside through the employee entrance, welcoming the cool October air after hours beneath warm chandeliers. Rain still drifted gently across Fifth Avenue, turning every streetlight into a blurred ribbon of gold. I pulled my coat tighter and started toward the subway station 3 blocks away. Halfway down the sidewalk, my phone vibrated with a breaking news alert. Prominent New York businessman Richard Holloway had died unexpectedly only minutes after attending a private charity function in Midtown. Authorities described the circumstances as unexplained while requesting privacy for the family. I froze beneath the awning of a closed bookstore. Richard Holloway. I had checked him into the gala less than 3 hours earlier. My stomach tightened for reasons I could not explain. Then another memory surfaced with uncomfortable clarity. The faint rust-colored mark on the fingertip of the white glove. It was probably nothing. It had to be nothing. Yet for the rest of the walk home, every reflection in every rain-covered window made me feel as though someone was quietly following a few careful steps behind me. Sleep never really came that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ethan Moretti standing perfectly still across the ballroom, watching me with the kind of quiet certainty that made me feel as though he had already memorized every expression on my face. By 6:30 the next morning, I had given up trying to rest and settled for strong coffee in my tiny Upper West Side apartment while the local news played softly in the background. Every station carried the same headline. Richard Holloway's unexpected death had become the biggest story in New York overnight. Reporters stood outside his Park Avenue residence while analysts speculated about business rivals, financial investigations, and confidential negotiations that had supposedly taken place in recent weeks. Nobody knew exactly what had happened, but everyone seemed eager to invent an answer. I kept telling myself it had nothing to do with me. I had coordinated one charity gala, exchanged fewer than 20 words with one influential guest, and picked up a misplaced glove. That was all. By 9 o'clock I was back at the Ashcroft Foundation headquarters helping organize donation records from the previous evening. The office buzzed with nervous energy. Volunteers whispered near the coffee machine. Administrative assistants refreshed news websites every few minutes. Even my supervisor, Denise Harper, who usually remained calm through every crisis, looked distracted. "Public relations wants every photo from last night reviewed before anything is released," she said, placing a stack of folders on my desk. "No surprises. No speculation. We stay professional." I nodded and opened the digital event archive. Hundreds of photographs filled the screen. Smiling donors. Award presentations. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors. Then one image made my hand freeze over the mouse. It showed the ballroom just moments before the keynote speech. Richard Holloway stood near the stage speaking with several board members. Only a few feet behind him, partially reflected in one of the tall mirrors, stood Ethan Moretti. He was not looking at Holloway. He was looking directly toward the place where I had found the white glove. A strange chill crept across my shoulders. I enlarged the image, hoping I had imagined it. Before I could study it any longer, the file suddenly disappeared from the screen. An error message replaced the photograph. Access restricted. I frowned and refreshed the folder. The picture was completely gone. That is strange, I whispered. Denise looked over from across the office. Everything all right? One of the files disappeared. She barely glanced up. Information technology has been removing duplicate images all morning. Do not worry about it. I tried to believe her, but the explanation felt too convenient. During lunch I stepped outside hoping fresh air would clear my thoughts. Autumn leaves drifted along the sidewalk while taxis splashed through shallow puddles left by yesterday's rain. My phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it before curiosity won. Miss Bennett, a calm male voice said after I answered. This is James. I work for Mr. Moretti. My heart skipped once. How did you get my number? Mr. Moretti wishes to remind you that some evenings are best remembered for their generosity, not their distractions. I stopped walking. I do not understand. You are not supposed to. The line went silent before I could ask another question. I lowered the phone slowly, suddenly aware that someone across the street was watching me from inside a black sedan parked beneath a row of turning maple trees. When our eyes almost met through the windshield, the car pulled smoothly into traffic and disappeared without making a sound. By the time the workday finally ended, I had convinced myself that everything could still be explained by coincidence. Powerful people hired assistants who found phone numbers. Photographs disappeared because someone made a mistake. Black sedans drove through Manhattan every minute of every day. I repeated those explanations as I stepped out of the Foundation building just after 5:30, wrapping my scarf tighter against the crisp October wind. The city looked perfectly ordinary. Office workers hurried towards subway stations. Street vendors filled the air with the smell of roasted chestnuts and fresh pretzels. Yellow taxis crawled through evening traffic beneath glowing billboards. Normal. Predictable. Safe. That illusion lasted less than 5 minutes. I had barely reached the corner of Lexington Avenue when my phone vibrated again. This time there was no caller identification. I hesitated before answering. Silence greeted me first. Then a calm female voice spoke. Miss Bennett, you attended the Ashcroft Gala last night. It was not a question. Who is this? I asked. The woman ignored me. You should be careful about what you remember. A chill traveled through my arms. I do not know what you are talking about. That would be the smartest answer you could give. The call ended. I stood frozen among dozens of strangers crossing the intersection while the walk signal counted down in bright white numbers. Nobody around me appeared to notice that my hands had started trembling. I slipped the phone into my pocket and continued toward the subway, telling myself it had to be some cruel prank connected to the news coverage. Then I noticed the same gray umbrella ahead of me for the third time. Its owner never looked directly at me, yet every time I slowed down, the umbrella slowed too. Every time I crossed a street, it crossed a few moments later. I ducked into a neighborhood bookstore without thinking. The warm smell of old paper wrapped around me as soft jazz drifted through hidden speakers. I wandered between shelves until my breathing steadied. After nearly 10 minutes I glanced through the front window. The gray umbrella was gone. Relief washed over me so quickly that I almost laughed at myself. I purchased a paperback I did not need and stepped back onto the sidewalk. A sleek black SUV rolled quietly to the curb before I had taken 3 steps. The passenger window lowered halfway. James, the man who had called earlier, offered a respectful nod. Miss Bennett. Every instinct told me to keep walking. Instead I stopped several feet away. How did you find me? He answered without hesitation. Mr. Moretti wanted to be certain you arrived home safely. I never asked for that. We know. His tone remained perfectly polite. Unfortunately, there are others asking questions today. Mr. Moretti believes their intentions are less honorable. My heartbeat quickened. Who are they? James looked briefly into the side mirror before returning his attention to me. That is exactly what we are trying to discover. Before I could respond, another dark vehicle slowed at the opposite side of the street. James noticed it immediately. His expression changed for the first time since we met, becoming sharper, more alert. He quietly opened the passenger door. Miss Bennet, I strongly recommend that you do not walk home alone tonight. I looked past him toward the crowded sidewalk. Everything still appeared ordinary, yet the feeling from the ballroom returned with startling clarity. Someone was watching. Only now I could no longer tell which strangers were simply passing by and which ones already knew my name. For several long seconds I stared at the open passenger door, unable to decide which felt more dangerous, getting inside a stranger's vehicle or walking away alone pretending none of this was happening. The evening traffic continued flowing around us as if Manhattan had not quietly shifted beneath my feet. James waited without rushing me. He did not repeat the invitation. He simply stood beside the SUV with the patient confidence of someone who already knew panic rarely responded well to pressure. I looked across the street again. The dark sedan that had slowed earlier was gone, swallowed by the endless stream of headlights. If I get in, I asked carefully, where are you taking me? Wherever you choose, James answered. Mr. Moretti requested only one thing. That you arrive safely. I studied his face for signs of deception but found nothing except quiet professionalism. Against every instinct that had guided me through 27 ordinary years, I climbed inside. The leather seats smelled faintly of cedar and expensive cologne. Warm air pushed away the October chill while the city drifted past the tinted windows in muted colors. James remained silent until we crossed Central Park South. Mr. Moretti prefers not to frighten people, he finally said. Then he has an unusual way of showing it, I replied. A trace of understanding crossed his face. That is fair. 20 minutes later the SUV stopped in front of my apartment building. Relief flooded through me. Thank you, I said, reaching for the door handle. Miss Bennet. James handed me a small cream-colored envelope sealed with dark blue wax. Mr. Moretti asked that you read this only after you were inside. Before I could refuse, he nodded politely and the vehicle disappeared into traffic. I climbed the narrow stairs to my third-floor apartment, locked every bolt, and stood quietly in the middle of my living room listening to the familiar hum of the refrigerator. Everything looked exactly as I had left it that morning. My bookshelf. My faded blue sofa. The framed photograph of my parents smiling on a beach in Cape Cod 15 years earlier. Normal things. Safe things. My hands were still shaking as I broke the wax seal. Inside rested a single folded card with only one sentence written in neat black ink. You were noticed before you noticed us. There was no signature. No explanation. Only those 8 words. I read them again and again until a knock echoed through my apartment. Sharp. Deliberate. My heart lurched. It was nearly 8 o'clock. Nobody visited me without calling first. I approached the door carefully and looked through the peephole. Denise Harper stood in the hallway holding a cardboard archive box against her hip. I unlocked the door immediately. Denise? What are you doing here? She forced a tired smile. I should ask you the same thing. You left this in your office. She held up the archive box. I figured you would need the event records tomorrow. I thanked her and invited her inside for coffee, but she politely declined. Before leaving, she hesitated as though debating whether to say something else. Claire, she said quietly, did anyone unusual speak to you at the gala? My stomach tightened. Why? Denise looked down the empty hallway before lowering her voice even further. Because this afternoon 2 different people came to the foundation asking very specific questions about you. They did not ask about donors. They did not ask about Richard Holloway. She met my eyes with genuine concern. They only wanted to know why Ethan Moretti spent several minutes talking to an event coordinator that nobody had ever heard of before that night. After Denise disappeared down the hallway, I locked the door and leaned against it, listening to the quiet hum of my apartment as though the walls themselves might offer an explanation. Two strangers had visited my office asking only about me. Not because of my work. Not because I had spoken to Richard Holloway. Because Ethan Moretti had spent a few minutes talking to me beside a ballroom stage. It sounded impossible, yet every strange moment from the last 24 hours fit together a little too well. I carried the archive box to my dining table, hoping ordinary paperwork would silence the growing storm inside my head. Donation receipts, seating charts, vendor invoices, volunteer schedules. Everything looked perfectly routine until I reached the folder containing security reports from the gala. Event coordinators always documented unusual incidents, no matter how small. A broken glass. A misplaced handbag. A guest requesting medical assistance. I slowly turned each page until one handwritten note caught my attention. 8:36 in the evening. Temporary camera interruption in the West Corridor. Duration 38 seconds. Issue resolved automatically. I frowned. The West Corridor connected the ballroom to the private conference suites where several high-profile guests had gathered before the charity dinner. I distinctly remembered walking through that hallway less than 10 minutes before finding the white glove. Why had the camera stopped recording at exactly that moment? Curiosity pushed aside common sense. I opened my laptop and logged into the Foundation archive using my employee credentials. Most surveillance footage required management approval, but event coordinators could review technical reports for insurance purposes. The loading icon spun for several seconds before an error message appeared across the screen. File permanently removed. My pulse quickened. Every trace connected to those missing 38 seconds had vanished. I sat back slowly, staring at the screen until another thought surfaced. The photographs. One image had already disappeared yesterday. Now the surveillance record was gone too. Someone was not simply protecting information. Someone was carefully erasing it. My phone vibrated on the table, startling me so badly that I nearly dropped it. A text message appeared from an unknown number. Do not access Foundation files again. I felt every muscle in my body tighten. I had never told anyone I was reviewing those records. I looked instinctively toward my apartment window. Rain had started again, soft drops sliding across the glass while traffic moved below in glowing ribbons of red and white. There was no one standing outside. No obvious watcher. Yet the message arrived less than a minute after the archive system denied my request. Someone knew exactly what I was doing. Before panic could fully settle in, another message appeared. This one came from James. Do not answer unknown calls tonight. We are aware of the situation. Relief mixed uneasily with frustration. They were watching too. I no longer knew which frightened me more, the people warning me away or the people promising to protect me. Around 10:30 I finally gave up on sleep and stepped onto the small fire escape outside my kitchen window, hoping the cold October air would clear my thoughts. The city stretched endlessly beneath low clouds, glowing with thousands of apartment lights. Somewhere among those buildings lived Ethan Moretti, the man whose calm voice seemed capable of changing the direction of complete strangers without raising its volume. I remembered the brief moment when I had handed him the white glove. He had not looked surprised that I found it. He had looked disappointed that I had found it first. As I stood there replaying every detail, my phone rang once more. This time the caller identification displayed a familiar name. Ethan Moretti. My thumb hovered over the answer button while the rain gathered quietly along the railing, and for the first time in my life, I realized that a single decision lasting only a few seconds could divide everything into a before and an after. My finger rested above the answer button while the rain tapped softly against the iron railing outside my apartment. Every instinct told me to reject the call, lock every door, and pretend none of this had ever happened. Instead, I answered. Miss Bennett, Ethan said in the same calm voice I remembered from the ballroom. Thank you for taking the call. I swallowed hard. You seem to know exactly when to find me. Only when it matters. His tone carried no arrogance, only certainty. You have been looking for answers. Someone erased photographs from the gala. Security files disappeared. People are asking questions about me. I think I deserve an explanation. Silence lingered for a moment. I could hear the faint sound of rain on his end of the line as well. You deserve honesty, he finally replied. Just not over the telephone. My grip tightened around the phone. Why should I trust you? You should not. Trust should never be given because someone asks for it. It should be earned. His answer caught me off guard because it sounded nothing like the rehearsed confidence I expected from someone with his reputation. Then why are you helping me? I asked. Because you became involved before you understood that you were involved. Another pause settled between us. Claire, there are people trying to discover what you remember. Some believe you witnessed something important. Others believe you know more than you actually do. Do you? I whispered. No. His answer came immediately. I believe you were simply kind enough to pick up something that did not belong to you. I closed my eyes. For the first time since the gala, someone had acknowledged the simplest truth. I had done what anyone would have done. Then tell them that, I said quietly. I intend to. Before I could ask another question, he continued. Tomorrow morning someone will invite you to a private breakfast meeting connected to the foundation. Do not accept. I frowned. How do you know that? Because the invitation has already been arranged. A cold sensation settled across my shoulders. Who arranged it? That is what I am trying to learn. The line became silent again before Ethan spoke one final time. There is one more thing you should know. His voice softened slightly, carrying something that sounded almost like regret. The white gloves are not what people think. I waited. What do you mean? People assume they hide guilt. He exhaled slowly. Mine hide scars. Before I could respond, the call ended. I remained standing on the fire escape long after the screen went dark. His last sentence echoed inside my mind with surprising weight. Mine hide scars. The words felt deeply personal, spoken by someone who rarely revealed anything about himself. The next morning I arrived at the foundation earlier than usual, hoping routine would finally return. Instead, Denise was already waiting beside my desk holding a cream-colored envelope. Good, she said with visible relief. I was afraid you might be late. What is that? I asked. A courier delivered it 20 minutes ago. She handed it to me. The envelope bore the elegant gold seal of the Ashcroft Foundation. Inside rested a formal invitation requesting my attendance at an exclusive breakfast discussion with several anonymous donors regarding future leadership opportunities. The meeting was scheduled for 8 o'clock the following morning at a private townhouse on the Upper East Side. My heartbeat slowed instead of racing. Ethan had known. Before anyone else. Before the invitation had even reached my hands. As I quietly folded the letter, I realized I was no longer asking whether he was telling the truth. I had started asking how he always seemed to know it first. For the rest of the day, I kept the invitation folded inside my desk drawer, but it felt less like a piece of paper and more like a countdown. Every time I opened a spreadsheet or answered another email, my eyes drifted back toward the envelope. Ethan had predicted it with impossible accuracy. That fact alone changed something inside me. Not trust. Not yet. But certainty that he was playing a very different game than everyone else around me. By late afternoon, the office had returned to its usual rhythm. Volunteers laughed over coffee. Phones rang without urgency. Deliveries arrived for next month's fundraiser. If someone had walked through the front doors, they would have believed nothing unusual had happened. Only I noticed the details that suddenly refused to feel ordinary. 2 unfamiliar men stood across the street pretending to study a building directory for nearly 20 minutes without entering. A woman in a navy coat passed our reception desk twice despite having no appointment. Even Denise glanced through the front windows more often than usual, although she never admitted why. Shortly before 5 o'clock, she stopped beside my desk carrying another stack of event files. "I almost forgot," she said. "Someone from the board requested copies of your volunteer evaluations." I looked up. "Mine?" "Apparently they were impressed with your work." Her smile looked forced. "Congratulations, I suppose." After she walked away, I opened the request form. It listed my employment history, emergency contacts, previous addresses, and even the university where I had earned my degree. This was no routine promotion review. Someone was building a profile. I quietly folded the paperwork back into its envelope just as my phone vibrated. James had sent only one sentence. "Do not leave through the front entrance today." No explanation followed. I glanced toward the reception windows. The two men across the street were gone, but an unfamiliar delivery van had replaced them. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe I had reached the point where every ordinary object looked suspicious. Even so, I slipped my phone into my pocket and walked toward the employee exit behind the loading dock. Cool autumn air greeted me along with the distant sound of traffic moving beneath the evening skyline. The alley behind the building was nearly empty except for a black SUV waiting beside the curb. James stepped out before I reached the sidewalk. "Thank you for trusting the message," he said. "I did not trust it," I answered honestly. "I simply decided it was safer than ignoring it." He nodded with surprising approval. "That is usually how trust begins." Before I could respond, another car rolled slowly past the end of the alley. It never stopped, yet I noticed the driver glance toward us before continuing through the intersection. James watched until the vehicle disappeared. "They are becoming impatient," he said quietly. "Who are they?" I asked again. This time he answered differently. "People who believe information has value, even when the information is incomplete." He opened the rear passenger door. "Mr. Moretti would like to speak with you face to face." I hesitated only a moment before getting inside. The city drifted quietly beyond the tinted glass while the SUV moved north through Manhattan with practiced confidence. Nearly 30 minutes later we turned through ornate iron gates and entered a private estate overlooking the Hudson River. The mansion beyond was elegant without being extravagant, surrounded by ancient maple trees whose orange leaves shimmered beneath carefully placed lanterns. Everything about the property felt peaceful, almost impossibly removed from the anxiety of the city. As I stepped out of the vehicle, the massive front door opened before anyone knocked. Ethan Moretti stood there without a jacket, wearing a simple white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms. For the first time since we met, neither of his hands wore white gloves. Ethan stepped aside without saying a word, inviting me into a home that looked nothing like the fortress I had imagined. Warm light reflected across polished oak floors. Shelves filled with well-worn books stretched from floor to ceiling. A fire crackled quietly inside a limestone fireplace while rain tapped gently against the tall windows overlooking the Hudson River. The entire house felt peaceful, almost impossibly ordinary. It was difficult to reconcile that calm with the man standing beside me. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I am not sure I had much choice," I admitted. He accepted the answer with a slight nod. "That is fair." James quietly disappeared toward another part of the house, leaving the two of us alone. Ethan gestured toward a sitting room where a tray with coffee and fresh pastries rested on a low table. "Please sit." I remained standing for another moment before taking a chair opposite him. My attention drifted instinctively toward his hands. Without the white gloves, faint pale scars stretched across the backs of both hands and along part of his wrists. They were old, carefully healed, and impossible to ignore. Ethan noticed where I was looking but made no effort to hide them. "You were wondering," he said softly. "Yes." He folded his hands together. "Years ago there was a fire at my family's estate. My younger sister was trapped inside." His voice remained steady, yet every word carried a quiet weight. I reached her. She survived. He glanced briefly toward the fireplace before continuing. The scars stayed. The gloves became easier than answering questions. I looked down, suddenly embarrassed by how quickly I had believed there must be a darker explanation. I am sorry, I whispered. Do not be. He offered the faintest smile. Most people assume they know the story before they ask. Silence settled comfortably between us for several seconds. It was the first peaceful silence I had experienced since the gala. Finally, I leaned forward. If the gloves are not the secret, then what is? Ethan's expression became serious again. He reached toward a leather folder resting beside his chair and carefully slid it across the table. Richard Holloway. I opened the folder slowly. Newspaper clippings, financial reports, charity records, and photographs filled the pages. None of them suggested criminal activity. Instead, they documented years of philanthropic projects, scholarship funds, and hospital donations. This does not make sense, I said. The news keeps describing him as a controversial businessman. Because someone wants the public looking in the wrong direction, Ethan replied. Richard was preparing to expose financial fraud involving several charitable organizations. I looked up in surprise. Including the Ashcroft Foundation? No. Ethan answered immediately. Ashcroft was one of the few organizations he believed remained honest. My relief lasted only a second. Then why am I involved? Ethan met my eyes directly. Because someone noticed that I spoke to you before Richard's death became public. They assumed I was warning you about something. But you were not. No. He shook his head. At that moment I only wanted you to forget the glove. I closed the folder, struggling to connect everything I had learned. So everyone is chasing a conversation that never actually happened. Exactly. He leaned back quietly. Unfortunately, once powerful people believe a secret exists, they rarely stop searching until they think they have found it. Before I could respond, James entered the room carrying a tablet. His calm expression had disappeared. Sir, he said carefully. We have a problem. Ethan accepted the tablet and his face grew noticeably still as he read the screen. After a long moment he turned it toward me. A security camera image filled the display. It showed the entrance to my apartment building less than 15 minutes earlier. Someone had slipped a cream-colored envelope beneath my front door. On the front, written neatly in black ink, were only 3 words. We remember everything. The room fell completely silent. I stared at the image on the tablet while my own apartment building looked strangely unfamiliar, as though it belonged to someone else's life. The security camera had captured only a single figure wearing a dark raincoat with the hood pulled low. No face. No hesitation. Whoever delivered the envelope had walked directly to my door, slid it underneath with practiced confidence, and disappeared less than 20 seconds later. How did you get this footage? I asked quietly. James answered before Ethan could speak. A neighbor across the street owns the camera system. We requested a copy as soon as we noticed unusual activity near your building. I looked toward Ethan. You noticed before I even knew someone had been there. He did not deny it. I promised you would not face this alone. Those words settled heavily inside me because they were spoken without drama, without trying to impress me. They sounded like a promise he had already decided to keep. Ethan stood and walked toward one of the tall windows overlooking the river. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the gardens outside covered in silver reflections from the landscape lights. Claire, he said without turning around, there is something I have not told you. I joined him near the window. I assumed there was. He nodded slightly. Richard Holloway contacted me 2 days before the gala. He believed someone inside his own circle was leaking confidential information. He asked me to help identify that person quietly. Did you? I asked. Not in time. His voice remained calm, but disappointment lingered beneath every word. After his death, the people responsible began searching for everyone connected to his final meetings. They expected documents, recordings, or witnesses. He finally turned to face me. Instead, they found you. I crossed my arms tightly. Because you spoke to me. Yes. His honesty left no room for anger. If I had walked past you that evening, none of this would have happened. I searched his face for excuses, but there were none. He accepted the responsibility completely. Somehow that made it even harder to blame him. James quietly placed another folder on the coffee table. There is one more development. Inside were copies of visitor records from the Ashcroft Foundation. I immediately recognized one name. Denise Harper. My supervisor had signed into the building nearly 2 hours after everyone else had left the previous evening. According to the records, she remained inside for almost 45 minutes. That cannot be right, I whispered. She told me she went straight home. James carefully turned another page. A second signature appeared beneath hers. Richard Holloway's personal executive assistant had entered the building that same night using temporary authorization. My heartbeat became uneven. What were they doing there? Ethan shook his head. That is what we need to discover. Before anyone could speak again, my phone vibrated. Denise's name appeared on the screen. I answered immediately. Claire, she said, sounding unusually anxious, I need to see you tonight. There is something I should have told you days ago. What is it? I asked. She lowered her voice almost to a whisper. Do not trust the visitor records. Someone changed them. My eyes met Ethan's across the room. Before I could answer Denise, another voice suddenly spoke somewhere beside her. It was calm, unfamiliar, and close enough to her phone that I knew whoever it belonged to was standing only a few feet away. Then the line went completely silent. The silence after the call felt heavier than the conversation itself. I stared at my phone, waiting for Denise to call back, but the screen remained dark. Ethan had not moved. Neither had James. None of us rushed to fill the silence because we all understood the same thing. Denise had not ended that conversation willingly. Ethan reached for his own phone and quietly spoke to someone on the other end. Find her last confirmed location. Use only trusted people. No unnecessary attention. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and looked at me. We are going to verify everything before we assume the worst. I nodded, grateful that he had chosen careful words instead of dramatic ones. My imagination had already created enough fear on its own. We gathered around the coffee table once more, spreading out every document connected to Richard Holloway, the Ashcroft Foundation, and the missing records. For the first time, I noticed a pattern hiding in plain sight. Every suspicious event happened after ordinary charitable gatherings. Scholarship dinners. Hospital fundraisers. Community development meetings. Places where successful people smiled for cameras and spoke about improving the future. These are all public events, I whispered. Ethan looked at the pages and then at me. Go on. I traced several dates with my finger. Nobody would question executives exchanging documents or having private conversations after charity events. Everyone would assume they were discussing donations. James leaned closer. That would explain why certain meetings never appeared unusual. Ethan slowly nodded. Richard suspected financial fraud, but perhaps he was looking in the wrong place. The transactions may have been disguised as philanthropy from the beginning. My pulse quickened. Then whoever altered the visitor records wanted investigators chasing the wrong timeline. Before anyone answered, James received a message through his earpiece. He listened quietly for several seconds before lowering his hand. We found Denise's car. I immediately stood. Is she there? No. His voice remained calm. The vehicle is parked outside the Ashcroft Foundation parking garage. Ethan picked up his jacket without hesitation. We are going. The drive back into Manhattan felt strangely peaceful despite everything racing through my mind. Rain had finally disappeared, leaving the streets shining beneath thousands of city lights. Ethan sat beside me in complete silence, reviewing printed documents while James drove with steady confidence through nearly empty avenues. No flashing lights. No dramatic urgency. Only quiet determination. When we arrived near the foundation, James parked half a block away. Denise's silver sedan stood exactly where he had described, untouched beneath a street lamp. Her handbag rested on the passenger seat, clearly visible through the window. "She would never leave that behind," I said softly. Ethan agreed with a slight nod. We entered the nearly empty parking garage through a side entrance reserved for employees. The concrete structure echoed with distant ventilation fans and the occasional sound of water dripping from the ceiling after the evening rain. Everything felt still. Too still. James searched the lower level while Ethan and I walked toward the employee elevators. That was when I noticed a single cream-colored envelope resting neatly on the polished concrete floor directly in front of the elevator doors. My name was written across the front in the same elegant black handwriting I had seen before. Ethan instinctively stepped closer, but I gently reached out and stopped him. "No," I whispered. "This one was left for me." I bent down slowly, picked up the envelope, and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. There were only 2 sentences. The first made my heart sink. "Stop searching for Richard Holloway." The second changed everything I thought I understood. "Ask Ethan Moretti why your father met him 15 years ago." The words on the page refused to make sense. I read them once. Then twice. Then a third time, hoping they would somehow become less impossible. My father had died when I was 12. He had been an accountant who loved sailing on summer weekends, collected old jazz records, and never missed one of my school concerts. There was nothing mysterious about him. Nothing that belonged anywhere near Ethan Moretti. Slowly, I lifted my eyes from the letter. Ethan was watching me without attempting to take the page from my hands. "Is it true?" I asked quietly. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the empty parking garage as though deciding how much of the past could still be carried into the present. "Yes," he finally said. "I met your father." My heartbeat seemed to stop altogether. 15 years ago? He nodded once. Only once. I folded the letter carefully before slipping it into my coat pocket. "Then tell me everything." Ethan drew a slow breath. "Your father's name was Daniel Bennett. He worked as a financial consultant for several nonprofit organizations throughout New York." I stared at him. That part one knew. "What you did not know," he continued, "was that Richard Holloway trusted your father more than almost anyone. When Richard began noticing irregularities in charitable accounts years ago, your father quietly helped him verify the records." I struggled to process every sentence. "You are saying my father investigated financial fraud?" "He helped uncover it." Ethan's voice remained calm. "He believed the information should be turned over through legal channels." Richard agreed. "Then why did they stop?" Ethan's expression grew unexpectedly heavy. "Because your father realized someone inside those organizations was monitoring every step they took. He chose to protect his family instead." I searched my memories desperately. My father had worked longer hours during his final year. He had taken unexpected business trips. My mother had once insisted they cancel a family vacation without explaining why. At the time I had been too young to question any of it. "Why did he meet you?" I whispered. Ethan looked directly into my eyes. He believed I could quietly confirm whether certain financial transactions connected to my family's business had been forged. I frowned. "Did you?" "Yes." He answered without hesitation. The records had been manipulated to create the appearance that legitimate charitable donations had been redirected through companies that never actually received them. James quietly approached us holding a small evidence envelope. "Sir," he said, "our team located this inside Denise Harper's vehicle." Ethan opened it carefully. Inside rested an old photograph protected by a clear plastic sleeve. 3 people stood together outside a waterfront conference center beneath bright summer sunlight. Richard Holloway, my father, and a much younger Ethan Moretti, perhaps only in his early 20s. They were all smiling. Not posing for reporters. Simply smiling like 3 people working toward the same goal. I felt tears gathering before I even realized why. Everything I believed about Ethan had been shaped by whispered rumors, frightened assumptions, and carefully edited headlines. Yet the evidence resting in front of me told a completely different story. My father had trusted him enough to stand beside him long before I had ever heard his name. Before I could speak, James received another message through his earpiece. He listened carefully, then looked toward Ethan with visible concern. We found Denise. Relief rushed through me so quickly that I almost smiled. Then James quietly finished his sentence. She asked to meet immediately. She says she has the original financial ledger. And she believes the person responsible has already been sitting on the Ashcroft Foundation board for more than 20 years. We met Denise just before sunrise inside a quiet reading room at the New York Public Library, a place that felt protected by history itself. Tall windows welcomed the first pale light of morning while the city outside slowly awakened. Denise looked exhausted, but when she saw me walk through the doorway beside Ethan, relief softened the fear in her eyes. She carried an old leather portfolio pressed tightly against her chest as though it contained something far more valuable than paper. I am sorry, she said before anyone spoke. I should have trusted you sooner. She carefully placed the portfolio on the long oak table and opened it. Inside rested handwritten financial ledgers, signed correspondence, and copies of charitable transfers dating back more than 20 years. Every page connected the same small circle of executives who had quietly redirected donations intended for hospitals, scholarship funds, and community programs into private investment companies hidden behind respectable names. Richard Holloway had discovered the pattern. My father had confirmed it. Denise had preserved the original records after realizing the digital archives were being quietly rewritten. I kept waiting for the right moment, she admitted. Then Richard died, and I understood there might never be a perfect time. Ethan slowly examined the documents before looking toward me. Your father was right. I frowned. About what? He believed truth survives longer than deception because someone always chooses to protect it instead of profit from it. Denise smiled sadly. That someone became me. Over the following weeks, independent investigators received complete copies of every original ledger through legal channels. Journalists verified the financial records with public filings. Auditors confirmed discrepancies that had remained hidden for decades. One by one, carefully constructed lies collapsed beneath ordinary facts that could no longer be erased. The headlines filled newspapers for weeks, yet none of them mentioned the white glove that had begun everything. None of them mentioned a frightened event coordinator who had simply bent down to pick up something that did not belong on the floor. They certainly did not mention the quiet man who had spent years carrying scars beneath elegant gloves while allowing the world to invent darker stories because correcting every rumor had never been as important to him as protecting the people around him. Life slowly returned to something resembling normal. The Ashcroft Foundation survived because its mission had always been genuine, even if a few trusted individuals had betrayed it. Denise accepted a new leadership role dedicated to rebuilding public confidence. Scholarship programs expanded instead of disappearing. For the first time in years, donations reached the communities they had always been intended to serve. One crisp afternoon in early November, I found myself standing beside the Hudson River with Ethan as autumn leaves drifted across the water. He no longer wore white gloves. The scars remained visible, and somehow they suited him better than perfection ever could. Do people still stare? I asked gently. He looked at his hands before smiling. Sometimes. Does it bother you? He shook his head. Not anymore. I laughed softly. That is progress. He looked toward the river, then back at me. You changed that. I smiled because I finally understood what he meant. The greatest scandals are rarely hidden beneath visible marks. They hide behind polished reputations, comfortable assumptions, and stories repeated often enough to become accepted as truth. My father had once chosen honesty over fear. Denise had chosen courage over silence. Ethan had chosen integrity over appearances. And I had learned that sometimes the smallest decision, like picking up a forgotten glove on an ordinary evening, can quietly change the direction of countless lives. In the end, it was never the white gloves that defined the man. It was the hands beneath them, scarred, steady, and finally unafraid to be seen.